And greetings, saints of the Most High. Rod Thomas here, and I want to welcome you to a new installment, this installment, of the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. Here on the Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections, we discuss, we study Yah's Torah by way of his weekly Torah readings, his Parshas. And this week we're in Parsha 143, which I've entitled, What Loving One Another Looks Like, the Morality and Love of Torah. And it is found in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 8 through chapter 23, verse 25. But before we get started, let's open in prayer. Abba, thank you for this day. Thank you for this Shabbat. Thank you for this Torah reading that we have before us, the blessing of your word and the blessing of your way of life, the covenant that you've established with us and that you've infused us with your Holy Spirit so that we may walk uprightly before you perfectly and live in accordance with your ways. Thank you, Father, for choosing us from the 7 billion or so people on this planet to be in covenant with you, to be your child, to be your children. Thank you for our life, health, and strength, the food, clothing, and shelter you provide us each and every day. And thank you for this platform, this forum, this fellowship. May it be pleasing unto you. May it bless you. That we are working and trying to please you, Father, and walk in your ways. So we ask that you infuse us with a greater unction of your power and authority through your Holy Spirit operating within us. We invite you in our midst this Shabbat, Father. And we ask that you open our eyes to see and our ears to hear and our minds and hearts to interpret, understand, and enact those things contained therein. Bless our respective homes. May the walls of our homes be impermeable to sin, to evil, and the floors upon which we sit, stand, and discuss and learn about your ways be holy. Bless each and every member here at this fellowship, especially those who are in harm's way around the world because of their professed love and faith in you. We love you and give you praise this day. And we do so in the name of our Master, Yeshua Messiah. I want to say before we begin, when I reflect back over I'm a news junkie. I've tried to extricate myself from the news. I've had to, on a number of occasions, take a few days break from the news because most of it is just bad. But of late, I think we all can be in agreement that there's nothing but bad out there. There's some good things there. Don't get me wrong. I do acknowledge that there are some good things happening. And you have to kind of be discerning. And you have to be in search of the good. And not just take just the bad that comes in. Sometimes we just have to actually look for good news. And I try to do that on a regular basis. But overall, when we look at this thing from a landscape perspective, the vast majority of news out there is just bad. And a good chunk of that bad news has to do with just the moral devastation that our nation and the other nations of the world have fallen into. The depravity, the sin, the hatred, the bigotry, the lying, the stealing, the killing and robbing and raping, the abortions, and all of these things that are just seeming to explode around us. All of these things are happening. Obviously, because man is just sinful. He has a sinful heart. And it's part and parcel of what he is today. But a bigger, more responsible perspective is when a nation peoples abandon or they just outright ignore Yah's Torah, Yah's ways, well, we get what we see happening around us. We get the violence. We get the disregard for human life, the disregard for Yah and his authority and his existence. We get this evil cloud and veil that hovers over the major cities of our nation and even into the level of our families. Lots of problems in every aspect of our society. And that's because the church triumphant, if you will, has decided in her infinite wisdom to completely disregard the first half of our Bibles, to teach the Satan-inspired gospel which says Torah has been done away with. Because now we live in grace. We don't have to keep Yah's instructions in righteousness. We don't have to walk in covenant relationship with the Almighty because Jesus Christ did it for us. All of that stuff, that Torah stuff, was nailed to the cross with Jesus. And now all we have to do is say a couple of words in the sinner's prayer. Maybe throw a few dimes into the offering plate. Maybe, depending on the congregation you're with, get dunked in some water. And then that's all you got to do. Oh, you got to abide by the rules of that particular congregation, that church that you've decided to sign up with. That's the only thing you really have to do. And then when the rubber really hits the road, you don't really have to do much of that either. You can just affiliate yourself and be okay in most cases. And so what happens? What happens with this religiosity, this denominationalism that has taken this nation over the last few centuries, that denies Yah's ways and his Torah? We have what we see here today. Young people who have no regard for the sanctity of life. Our leaders having no regard for the well-being of her citizens, of their constituents. They don't care. They're more concerned about their holding on to power because they are bereft. They are deprived. They're depraved of any moral standing. They don't know what it means to love one another. They don't understand that Torah actually holds within it the morality and love that Father requires of us. And just because Father said, I'm telling you, it benefits us all when we follow his ways. It's not a burden. Oh, no. It's not a burden. It's a joy to walk in his ways. And society benefits when one society agrees and determines to walk in Yah's ways. All the stuff we see going on, if they were to do this, ideally, we know that they're not, but ideally, we wouldn't see what we see going on around us. These are righteous living principles that separate the faithful covenant-walking child of the Most High from the world's ways. And how they conduct themselves and live out their lives. Some say that these principles, however, no longer apply to us because we are now under grace, I just mentioned. And the truth of the matter is, indeed, we are under Yah's grace. However, Yah's grace is intended to provide us the means by which to resist the ways of this world and to live in accordance with his holy and righteous ways. For Yah's ways are the only ways that we, his elect and his children, must live in order to maintain or to remain in a covenant relationship with him and to receive the kingdom of Jehovah. You see, there are no free lunches out there. And I've said this many, many times. What do you mean by there's no free lunches? Grace is a free gift of God. Eternal life is a free gift of God, Rod. Well, it's a free gift, but there are some things on our part that we have to do in order to qualify, if you will, for that free gift. Let's say qualify. If we don't do things Yah's way, if we instead do things our way, what makes us think? What kind of gall do we have? And this is what the church has been teaching us. What kind of gall do we have to think that we call the shots and that he's just going to go and give us a free ticket, that free lunch, and usher us into the kingdom? We'll enter like my pastor when I was in the Baptist church of my youth, saying we're going into heaven like a fire sale. What's a fire sale? I was young when he kept saying, now, what is a fire sale? Well, I learned eventually that a fire sale is when a person's home caught fire, and the things that they were able to salvage from that fire, they would often have a sale to get rid of them, because their home was destroyed and they wanted to get rid of things and start anew somewhere else. But the problem with a fire sale, the things that were sold in that fire sale, they smell. They carry the smell of the fire, the smoke, the soot. A lot of it is damaged from the fire. And so we think that we can just enter into and waltz into the kingdom because we have been saved by grace, and that we can just carry in that baggage. We can go in like that fire sale item and live as we choose, like we do today. Yah's ways are the only ways that we, his elect, must live. And so we study, and we receive, and we obey these instructions because we love Jehovah, our Elohim, the creator of the universe. And we faithfully obey these instructions because it pleases Yah. It pleases him to see his children living in obedience to his ways, and because it's just the right thing to do. Now, as we look at the lay of the land for this parashah, this Torah reading for this week, which is Deuteronomy. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8 through chapter 23, verse 25, we see several key obedience and spiritual takeaways or elements. What we'll come across in this reading are the following: the essentiality of making our dwelling safe for family and brethren. The instruction to love one another. What it means, what it looks like to love one another. The separation of classes, and those classes include the animal classes, the vegetation class, and classes of clothing wear like linen and wool. The wearing of tzitzits. Raising godly children, daughters and sons. The sanctity of marriage. Maintaining purity in the camp of Jehovah. in our homes, essentially. The disqualifiers to the congregation of Israel, those things that disqualify one from being in the congregation of Israel, or ancient Israel, will be specific. Prostitution, homosexuality, and other forbidden sexual activity. Those prohibitions. Helping our brethren in need and not taking advantage of them in the process. Proper treatment of foreign slaves. And greed. So, let's get into the study today. We'll begin at chapter 22, verse 8. And I will be using the Robert Alter translation of the 5 books of Moses. And I'll actually put the passage in the show notes for you, or for your reference, if you're so inclined to reference it in your listening of this program or actually reading. I'll put also the transcript of the show, transcripts of this post in the show notes for you as well. Verse 8, it reads, when you build a new house, remember, they're still in the wilderness. So this is all part of the preparation process, akin spiritually to the sanctification process, if you will, if you want to spiritualize this thing. But the reality is that this nation, Yisrael, this second generation coming out of Egypt, having the first generation that came out of Egypt, now all dead and gone. Now we have this new generation who have circumcised hearts, who are obedient, and they're walking in covenant relationship with the Almighty. And Moshe here is preparing this nation of youngins, these young ones, to go in and possess the land. And so he's laying out for them here in Deuteronomy all the things they're going to need to learn and then to walk out in order for them to prosper in the land. So he says, when you build a new house, in parentheses, in Israel, when you enter the land of promise, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you not put blood guilt in your house should someone fall from it. So what we have here is instructions on making our homes safe for our families and guests. And so Abba instructs us to erect parapets around the edges of our homes once we enter the land of promise. Parapets. We'll get a little bit into what specifically that is. It's structure that prevents people from falling off the edge of a home. People back in ancient times, as well as even in some areas of the Middle East today even, spend a lot of time on their roofs, and they do so for various and sundry reasons, which are those reasons are beyond the topic of this post. But with that extended time on the roofs of their homes, remember that as the side. See how my brain works. Remember the dream. This is seen brilliantly. Remember, Peter was on the roof of a home when he had the he had the vision of the clean and unclean animals. He was on the roof in the heat of the day, resting, and he had a vision. Same principle. It carries through. So they spend a lot of time on these roofs, and with that extended time on roofs of their homes, there exists a very real fall danger. You know, you get too close to the edge, you're not paying attention, it's dark, you have an obstructed view, and before you know it, you've fallen off the roof, or some family member falls off the roof, or a guest falls off the roof and injures themselves, or even dies in the process. The parapet was a structure that offered a protective barrier around the roof of one's home to prevent people from falling and injuring themselves. And depending on the height of the structure, we know a fall could result in death. So it was imperative. It was only sensible that one put something in place to prevent such a tragedy. As an aside, it should be of no surprise that the rabbinic sages had to put their 2 cents into this instruction. Parapets, according to the ancient Jewish rabbis or their laws, were required to be a minimum of 10 handbreadths. 10 handbreadths in height, which translates to about 30 inches high. Now, all of this turns out to be in response to one's death from a Hebrew's roof because of the negligence of the owner in putting up things to prevent such things. The death of one who would fall because of such negligence would be viewed by the community, by the religious leaders, as gross negligence or negligent homicide. So it was taken very seriously. So what we see then illustrated here, in a good sense, in a sense, is what love for one's neighbor looks like. And for us today, we can draw from this example in our own day-to-day lives. Are we taking proper precautions to make our families and visitors to our homes safe? Do we care enough about others that we are willing to do the right thing and make the necessary improvements to our dwellings to prevent any chances of injury or harm? Because to do so is to be a responsible homeowner and an obedient keeper of Torah. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of spiritual applications also that can be applied here, but the one point that I really want to put forth here for us to all consider is the importance, what loving one another looks like. Because when you think about others and their well-being and protecting them, especially when they're within the safety and confines of your home, by putting things up to prevent injury, you're showing forth love for them, concern for them. Now, a lot of idiots would say, well, I don't want to be sued, and that's why I'm doing it. So they do it out because they're selfish. They're selfish-minded. But we shouldn't look at it that way. We should look at it from the perspective of that we love those people who are in our homes, that we invite into our homes, that are our guests. We want them to be comfortable. We want them to be safe and happy. And we don't do things for the purposes of preventing us from being sued. To do so is just selfish. So we take precautions. And we do the right thing. And we put up structures to prevent tragedy. The next section of our Torah reading is found in chapter 22, verses 9 through 11. Verses 9 through 11. And we're talking about separation and class distinctions. Beginning at verse 9, and it reads, "You shall not plant your vineyard with mixed seeds, lest the ripe crop be proscribed. The seed that you plant and the yield of the vineyard, you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear sha'aknez, wool and linen together." Here we have a prohibition against planting mixed seeds, planting them specifically in our vineyards. 2, plowing our fields with mixed species of animals. And 3, wearing garments that consist of a mixture of wool and linen, which in the Hebrew is termed shechatnetz. And when we talk about linen here, in this sense, it's a fabric that is made up of flax. Flax. We won't discuss all of that stuff because that would take us way off course, but you can reference what flax is and the use in certain materials in Exodus chapter 30, verses 22 through 27, and Exodus chapter 39, verse 8. Now, the linen wool mixture, it was unique to the composition of the priestly garments and the construction of the tabernacle. And this is verified even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically scroll 4QMMT. And the whole point behind this mixture has nothing to do with some kind of scientific issue that I've actually come across articles or discussions that said, oh, mixing linen and wool is bad for one's something. I don't even know what it's called, but some kind of metabolic activity that goes on in a person's body, that the mixture thereof of linen and wool causes that metabolic situation or our metabolic systems to not fare too well. It inhibits a beneficial process within us, so we're not to wear it. But the problem is that people who come up with that foolishness aren't reading the whole passage. They're reading this prohibition of us not wearing clothing that is a mixture of linen and wool. They're reading it out of context because the priest garments and the fabric that made up the tabernacle were a mixture of linen and wool. So it has nothing to do. God didn't give us, Jehovah didn't give us this prohibition because it causes problems within us. He's giving it to us because he's separating the holy from the profane and the common. Separating the holy from the profane and the common. And the Hebrew terminology at play here in terms of the linen wool mixture is, as I just mentioned, shachatnez, the mingling of wool and linen. Looking at the unequally yoked beast of burden prohibition, it's obviously a direct tie to our responsibilities toward the well-being of Yah's animal creation. We don't have, in this case, two beasts of burdens, a donkey and an ox plowing a field together. They're two different animal classes. And the ox is much more or is much stronger than a donkey. And the power of the ox is going to overwhelm the lesser power of the donkey. And it's going to create an untenable situation for the donkey. And it's going to cause an irritant for the ox. And it could create harm. And Father has always cared about the well-being of his whole creation. So he put in place these requirements, these rules on how we are to treat our animals. The mixing of seed seems to get varied opinions amongst Torah and denominational teachers, but one seemingly sound explanation, I should say, is Yah's insistence that his vegetation creation order be maintained by his human creation. As far as Yah and we are concerned, hybridization is strictly prohibited. So when we're talking about mixing seed directly, Father doesn't want any hybridization happening. He wants separation. That's why we have apples and oranges and banana, because we don't mix them. This GMO stuff, this mixing and matching and all of this stuff that we've been doing to our food supply, we're finding now has created a problem, a challenge to our foodstuffs, to our food supply. Our food supply is tainted. Father never intended for us to mix foods together. He never intended that. But we have to do what we like to do. All under the guise of we're making food much more abundant and accessible to the world. Father says, no, don't do it. If you're going to plant a vineyard, plant the grapes there. That specific species of grapes, plant them. But don't add into it other vegetation, other types of seed. And all of these things, these separation and class distinctions have tremendous spiritual application attached to them. Certainly, the mixing of seed has been likened unto the word, seed being the word, and then, of course, the mixing of seed being good word versus bad word, error versus truth, the mixing of truth with error. We see that hugely playing parts in denominationalism and churchianity. Mixing, and we call that syncretization, by the way, or syncretism. I've mentioned a lot about that. The bringing in of pagan elements and infusing them into the truth of the gospel in Yah's Torah. Lots of that. Father doesn't want the mixing. That's a spiritual application of that. Being unequally yoked, and not to call us animals, a beast of burden, but it can easily be translated over to how we are yoked with in relationships with one another. Our spouses, our friends, our family, our co-workers. You see, when you're walking in this way of ours, and you're saddled or you are connected with people who don't respect your life, that don't agree with your lifestyle, they create impediments and challenges for us. And so, you're unequally yoked, especially when unequally yoked comes into play when you may be considering a spouse to marry someone new or to marry someone, and you are coming into this relationship, you are walking in the way, but your potential or future spouse can't stand this. They don't agree with it. They reject it. But you decide to go through with the marriage. Well, you're in for an unequally yoked situation. We see unequally yoked situations in our families. I've had it happen in my family. When I came to faith, my biological family hated the fact that I was in this faith. And I wonder, with Hillary and I withstood tremendous ridicule and persecution because of our faith. And many of you are experiencing the same thing today. So the mixing of seed and being unequally yoked is certainly a situation that we must be aware of and take appropriate action and let the Holy Spirit guide our actions. Learn how to discern that which is not of truth and spit out the error. This, which leads us into the whole issue of the linen issue, linen and wool issue. Learning what is holy, distinguishing the holy from the profane. We are called to be priests in Jehovah's kingdom. So we must live priestly life. So we must put on garments that are fitting of priest, while the rest of the world can live their lives in these prohibited garments of theirs, the garments of evil and unrest that I spoke about earlier. So our garments must be seen by all as distinction, distinguishing us from the rest, from them. And we shouldn't give in to the ridicule or the despisement of these people. You're not like us. We don't like you. And then, of course, the persecution that comes with it. And if we don't have the persecution now, it's coming. Let's just be aware of that. Our day is coming. So right now is the time to take this stuff that we're talking about now, digest it, and allow it to permeate and percolate in ourselves, in our being, in our spirit, so that when the time of trouble comes, which is coming, and if you're looking at the news like I do every day, you see it right at the doorstep almost. We better be ready. We better be prayed up, fasted up, studied up. Because the times ahead are going to be challenging. Let's move on. I can get going here. I love this stuff. I can get going. All right, let's move on to chapter 22, verse 12. Verse 12 talks about tassels, aka tzitzits. And verse 12 reads, "You shall make yourself tassels on the four corners of your garment, with which you cover yourself." So here we have the instruction for Hebrews to make for themselves tassels. And the Hebrew word here for tassels is gedalim, which it differs somewhat in the terminology that is used in Numbers chapter 15, verses 38 through 34, where it talks about fringes, and fringes in the Hebrew is tzitzit, or tzitzits. I call them tzitzits. I've heard of some messianics refer to it as zitzits. Some, of course, use the English parlance of fringes and tassels, but I use the word tzitzits. But tassels, as used here, gedalim, is used only here. This Hebrew word gedalim is used only here and in one other place in Scripture, 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 17. And it describes, in that case, wreaths of chain work on the capitals of the courtyard of Solomon's temple. Now, some commentators have tried to throw confusion into this and say that the tassels that we find here in Deuteronomy 22, verse 12, are not the same as the fringes in Numbers chapter 15, verses 38 through 41. And I call hogwash on that. It's the same thing. We're talking about tzitzits. I'm just saying, it makes sense in both cases there to be sewn or attached to the four corners or wings of a Hebrew's garment. And they're to consist of threads of white with one strand of blue in the midst of that grouping of white threads. Tzitzits. And, one can get into the efficacy of the colors and how it's supposed to be tied and all that. That's beyond what we're here to talk about today. But what I want to get the point I want to get across here is that this is a universal commandment. Although certain, and I'll explain what I mean by universal commandment, some rabbis have restricted the wearing of tzitzit or tzitzits to just men. But when I say universal commandment, I say so for two reasons. One, I believe women should also be wearing them. And two, I believe that it applies to us today. I am a huge proponent of tzitzit wearing. I've worn tzitzits in public now for 8 to 9 years. I can't remember exactly when I started wearing them. Every day that I breathe air, I go out and wear them. And I wore them at work when I was working in a very, very, very secularized position out there. And I've worn them now in 4 years of retirement. When I go out, when I'm in home, I wear them. And I believe we all should wear them. It's a commandment of Jehovah, just like the other commandments that we're just talking about here. But these are one of these small commandments where it's only mentioned twice in the whole of Torah, and people love to overlook this and say, well, it doesn't apply to us because we don't have four corners to our garments today. It doesn't matter. We do the best we can with what we have. There's nothing that prevents us from wearing tzitzis, and I love the options that we have for tzitzit wearing. So there's no excuse for not wearing tzitzits today. You can get just the individual tzitzits, which I have, that you just tie onto your belt loops, the belt loops of your pants. Or you can get these micro tallits that have the actual individual four tzitzits tied into a fabric that is like a micro or a small tallit. And then you can just sew your belt through that tallit and you can wear them quite conveniently. I've had a couple of micro tallits over the last 8 or 9 years, and one got ruined because some bleach spilled over it. So I had to discard that. And the other one, I was wearing out shopping, and I didn't string it through my belt. I shoved it into, I kind of shoved it in because I was in a hurry, and I shoved it into my waist of my pants, and I lost it. And that was the one I really liked. It was heartbreaking. It's just a little silly side story, but anyway, that just shows how big a part of tzitzit wearing, how important it is to me. The other thing about tzitzit wearing is that outside our faith, and even probably within some sectors of our faith community today, a lot of people are anti-tzitzit wearing, and my brother, who is in the fringe areas, my brother-in-law, who is in the fringe areas of our faith, had a huge problem with me wearing them. And he felt that I was introducing confusion into the body of Messiah by wearing them because it doesn't apply to us today. So he and I went back and forth and la-di-da-di, and it has kind of created a rift between us. It's not an irreparable rift, but it is certainly there, and it has hindered our relationship. We once had a wonderful, brilliant relationship, but when I started wearing tzitzits, that relationship was damaged. That's how powerful the wearing of tzitzits can be, the impact it can have, that people actually feel the way they do. I will never separate myself from a brother or sister who chooses not to wear tzitzits in our faith community. That's a decision, like physical circumcision, that must be made between the individual and Abba. Who am I to come in and determine for you what you can and can't do in terms of obeying Torah? It says it in Torah, wear them, so I wear them. You don't agree that it's applicable. Okay, so we choose to disagree. Let's walk on in faith and continue to fellowship. It's not one of those things that should prevent us from fellowshipping, but it unfortunately does in many circles. Now, let's move on. I've talked enough about tzitzits. I could go on and on about it, and maybe one day I'll revisit it and do a post on tzitzits, because it's so important. But for now, we've got much more to discuss. The sacred reputation of a virgin of Yisrael, and that has to do with raising godly daughters and by extension, raising godly men. And this is chapter 22, verses 13 through 29. Let's read it. Should a man take a woman and come to bed with her and hate her, and he impute to her misconduct and put out a bad name for her and say, this woman did I take, and I came close to her, and I found no signs of virginity for her. The young woman's father and her mother shall take and bring out to the elders of the town at the gate the signs of the young woman's virginity. Verse 16. And the young woman's father shall say to the elders, my daughter I gave to this man as wife, and he hated her. And look, he has imputed misconduct, saying, I found no sign or signs of virginity for your daughter. But these are the signs of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread out the garment before the elders of the town. Verse 18. And the elders of that town shall take the man out and punish him, and they shall fine him 100 weights of silver, and give it to the young woman's father, for he put out a bad name for a virgin in Israel. And she shall be his wife, he shall not be able to send her away ever. Verse 20. But if this thing be true, no signs of virginity were found for the young woman, they shall take the young woman out to the entrance of her father's house, and the men of her town shall stone her to death. For she has done a scurrilous thing in Israel, to play the whore in her own father's house. And you shall root out the evil from your midst. Verse 22. Should a man be found lying with a woman who has a husband, both of them shall die. The man lying with the woman and the woman as well, and you shall root out the evil from Israel. Verse 23. Should there be a virgin young woman betrothed to a man, and a man find her in the town and lie with her, you shall bring them both out to the gate of the town and stone them to death, the young woman for her not crying out in the town, and the man for his abusing his fellow man's wife, and you shall root out the evil from your midst. Verse 25. But should the man find the betrothed young woman in the field, and the man seize her and lie with her, only the man lying with her shall die. Verse 26. And to the young woman you shall do nothing. The young woman bears no capital offense. For as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this thing. For he found her in the field. The young woman could have cried out, and there would in the field. Let me read that again. Verse 27, for he found her in the field. The young woman could have cried out, and there would have been none to save her. Should a man find a virgin young woman who is not betrothed, and take hold of her and lie with her, and they be found, the man lying with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 weights of silver, and she shall be his wife. Inasmuch as he abused her, he shall not be able to send her away all his days. So in this passage, we find that if an Israeli male marries a professed Israeli female virgin, who at some point and for whatever reason falls out of favor with him, and he accuses her of not being a virgin, in terms of verbiage, virgin here in the Hebrew is betulim, which means the condition of virginity and the concrete evidence of her virginity. But he accuses her of not being a virgin as she originally attested to him before they were married. Thereby, he impugns her integrity. Well, it falls to this woman's parents, I should say, to present to the court, the lawmakers or the law enforcers, the evidence of her virginity. Now, we're not going to get into all of that here in this post, but the evidence is spelled out here in the post, and then you can do some deeper research in what that sheet, that garment is that is talked about as evidence. But after verifying that evidence, however, the man making the false allegation will receive punishment that includes a beating, financial reparations to the woman's parents because he impugned her integrity. The impugning of the integrity of a virgin of Israel is a big deal. But he impugned her integrity and then remain married to that man. She will get to stay married with this man until either dies. And the reason for this sentence against the man is that he put forth a bad name for a virgin of Israel. But on the other hand, if it turns out that there is no evidence to the fact of the woman's virginity, and it turns from, it would seem, further inquiry that the woman was not a virgin as declared to her husband before their marriage, that woman would be stoned to death by the men of the community in front of the woman's parents' home. In this, according to Jehovah, evil will be rooted from the community's midst. Now, let's stop here. It would seem as though there is a stark disparity in the degree of punishment as it relates to either party of this tragic situation is concerned. Because in both instances, either the husband or the wife is lying. If the man is found to be lying, he receives just humiliation, the paying of the paying of the parents for impugning the integrity of their daughter, a beating, a pretty rough beating, and then having to be forced to remain married to this woman that he hates. So he's humiliated. If the woman, on the other hand, is found to be lying, well, she receives the death penalty. And it has always troubled me, the disparity. And I'll be transparent with you. You know how I feel about women in faith. I've done lots of posts on Yah's love for women and the place women have in ministry and in the body of Messiah and in the kingdom. So I kind of wondered if there was some manipulation of the text, that maybe this was kind of skewed toward the misogynistic side of Judaism by some scrupulous scribes or translators. Well, that's kind of a bad attitude to have. I have to trust Scripture, the integrity of the Scriptures. So there has to be another reason Father has this disparity here. Because it's not entirely clear from the text why the disparity. But it would seem to me that the disparity in the degree of punishment was not about the man lying versus the woman lying about their respective positions on this subject. The disparity appears to rest on the issue of chastity and deception on the woman's part. Chastity and deception. Marriage was one of those sacred pillar institutions, or it still is, I should say. It's one of those sacred pillar institutions that Father was unequivocal on. You see, to Jehovah, marriage was always intended to be for life, the life of the man and the life of the woman. And the institution of marriage was intended as the only instrument or means by which we are to procreate. It also was intended to serve as the means by which our worship and our glorifying of Jehovah here on this planet would be magnified. The man and the woman becoming one through the institution of marriage would create a situation of marriage and service that would be impossible with just one individual. Synergy. Two are better than one. As far as intimacy is concerned, it is reserved only for marriage, period. And sex outside of marriage is a transgression of Torah. It's not that it's old-fashioned. like the folks used to say when I was coming up. That's old folk. That's old fashioned. We do things different now. No, it's Torah. It's Father's ways of righteous living. Sex outside of marriage is a transgression of Torah. So there's to be no shacking up. There's to be no premarital relations, as it is very much the common practice among secularists today, and even some people in faith today with us that feel it's okay to live with someone they like, someone they want to be with. Common law setups, common law situations, they call it. No, it doesn't work that way. It's a transgression of Torah. Doesn't matter what I think. It really doesn't matter what you think. It's what Yah thinks. And what Yah says is no. His only institution where man and women come together is marriage. And sex outside of that framework of marriage is a transgression and violation of Torah. So when Scripture speaks of the marriage bed, and you'll see that throughout Scripture, well, we are to always understand it to be a euphemism for marital relations, intimacy, if you will. So it was imperative that the man and the woman get this whole marriage thing right for a lot of things. A lot was riding on it. So this whole understanding of who the other person is, making sure you're equally yoked, was very important before the persons get married. And the woman who elected, for whatever reason, to live a less than chaste life prior to marriage, but then hides that reality from her betrothed, that is, she deceives her to-be, her fiancé, it only compounds her sin. Fornication is sin. So she goes out, she decides to live an unchaste life, commits fornication, or even worse. It compounds her sin then to deceive her betrothed husband. Because the husband can then, or the to-be husband can then opt out. So there's ample opportunity to have that put forth. But there were obviously cases where there were women who decided, I'm going to keep my loose ways prior to marriage a secret. They went out and sowed their wild oats. She went out and sowed her wild oats. So she's going to keep it a secret now. She wants to get things right, and she wants to marry and have children and have a wonderful family and live ever or happily ever after. And then something like what is described in this chapter happens, and she faces the death penalty. And this all could have been remedied if she would have just been upfront with her husband and been honest. Or let's just take it down to brass tacks. If she would have just lived a godly woman's life and done what she was supposed to and not been unchaste, but live a chaste life. Now, ancient rabbis viewed this mitzvah as extremely draconian or harsh, and they drew up various impediments to carrying out the required punishment, such as requiring at least 2 witnesses attest to the woman's fornication prior to marriage. So the rabbis decided to put a fence around Torah And instead of the violation of Torah, they wanted to prevent Torah from being enacted. So they created a almost impossible impediment to the carrying out of this mitzvah. You need to provide at least 2, even 3 witnesses to the fact that you had fornicated with this other man prior to your marriage. And the accusation and any such evidence the crossed husband might produce against his wife was viewed as circumstantial. So the scorned husband now might make the allegation, but because there is no witness to the woman's unchaste ways, her loose ways, then the case is thrown out. And they're probably all both given. The man is given what he wants, and that's a way out of the marriage. And he's granted a writ of divorce so he can put his wife away, and she gets to somehow keep her integrity intact, although it's been damaged. But this is what the rabbis did to get around this Torah mitzvah. I contend there is another way to view this disparity, though. The embittered husband had the option. If he truly believed he was deceived by his wife as it related to her supposed virginity, he had the option to not put his wife through such an ordeal. For if he truly loved her, he would have the righteous option of forgiving his wife of her deception and her loose ways prior to their marriage and living happily ever after with her. If he loved her, if he truly did. If anything, if indeed the husband's suspicions were correct, well, this mitzvah served as a test of the state of the husband's heart and his love for his wife. This mitzvah, if carried out by the husband, knowing the potential outcome his accusations would bring to his wife and to his wife's parents, would certainly prove the hatefulness of the husband, and no doubt his life would be miserable from that point onward. The husband was not required to bring down judgment upon his wife, even if his suspicions were valid. And the text stipulates that he comes to hate her, and he elects to impute to her misconduct and put out a bad name for her, verses 13 and 14. So Jehovah left the husband an option for the out, if you will, as a means of showing his true love for his wife. And this is what I believe Father always really wanted to see happen here. He knows he's dealing with humans, sinful humans, and he knows this kind of thing could happen. So he provides an opportunity for the man to step up and be godly, to forgive and to forget. The spiritual application here is undeniable. Jehovah likened Yisrael as his wife, as he entered into a marriage covenant with her. Yet, she was not chaste. She was never chaste. She was, from the very beginning, a deceptive and stiff-necked wife. And according to the terms of the covenant Yah made with her, he had every right to cast Yisrael, his wife, away from him. But he didn't. In fact, he could have had her destroyed, especially after entering into a covenant relationship with her. He has stayed true, however, to his covenant with her because he loved her. And the same applies to us today. Most, if not all of us, came to this faith covenant relationship with Jehovah in less than a spiritually chaste state. And after we enter into a covenant relationship with him, well, we all have the tendency to violate the terms of that covenant relationship. Yet Father is loving and kind to us. He doesn't want to hurt us nor cast us away from him. So he provides us the means by which to remain in covenant with him. Jehovah, ideally speaking, always intended that a woman entering marriage would be a virgin. And this works only when the man not transgresses Torah himself. So the man can't get off the hook here. It only works when the man does not transgress Torah himself. For if all men of the congregation of Israel were truly walking in covenant relationship with the Almighty, well, women would remain virgins till marriage. There would not be infidelity. There wouldn't be unchaste virgins out there because there would be no men to contribute to the delinquency of this woman, of the virgins of Israel. And men would also remain virgins till marriage too. So the onus is placed on the males of Israel to toe the line as it relates to them and their families living righteous and Torah-based lives. As head of the household, the husband was ultimately responsible for raising his sons and his daughters to act in accordance with Yah's holy and righteous ways. So a woman's father was ultimately responsible for his daughter's chastity until she married. An execution of the unchaste woman would serve as a loud acknowledgement of his negligence in properly raising his sons, and especially his daughters. And so even today, it falls to godly fathers to safeguard their daughters and teach them to be godly women of Jehovah and to remain chaste until Yah blesses them with the right godly man. And then we come to another situation that involves a betrothed female Israeli woman who engages another man in sexual relations, who, if caught, both the offending man and the virgin woman are to be stoned to death. So Jehovah sees a marriage betrothal as binding as the sacred marriage covenant. A betrothal is binding as a marriage covenant. What do I mean by that? The man who defiles another man's wife, although betrothed, and the virgin, if caught in the act of adultery, are subject to being stoned to death, again to rid evil from the midst of the community. And the woman in this case is punished because her contact with this man was not that of rape. If, however, the woman calls for help because the man is raping her, only the man is executed by stoning. A betrothal was just like a marriage covenant. It could result in the death of somebody a man who decides to rape a betrothed woman. That's how serious a betrothal was. It carried with it the weight of or equal to that of marriage. So this mitzvah addressed the question of consensual sex outside of marriage. If the act occurred within a densely populated community and it was not a consensual act, but rather the man was forcing himself on the betrothed woman, in plain language, he was raping her, it would be presumed that someone would hear the betrothed woman's distress, her distress calls, if you will, and someone or someones would render assistance to the woman. In that case, the man would be stoned to death for his gross disrespect. And here it is, his disrespect in violation of the marriage betrothal covenant. Again, that's why this is so serious. Father sees this as serious. Silence, however, on the part of the woman would be indicative of the act being consensual. In this case, if caught, both the man and the betrothed woman faced summary execution. If, on the other hand, the act occurs outside the densely populated community, such as in a rural setting, well, rape is gradually, or I should say, let me back up, it is generally presumed, and only the man would be subject to execution in that case. And it would be presumed in such a case that no one would be within reasonable earshot to hear, excuse me, throat got a little dry there for a minute. But it was presumed in such a case that no one would be within reasonable earshot to have heard and to have responded to the betrothed woman's cry for help. Thus, in this case, the woman would be deemed innocent. So, where there is no hard and fast evidence of the betrothed woman crying out for help, she is presumed innocent. Now, there are, of course, many questions surrounding this mitzvah, but the bottom line is, if indeed the betrothed woman is godly, having received the proper training from her parents on how to behave, and she in turn adheres to that Torah training, well, such situations ideally would not occur. And the same bottom line applies to the men. The man who walks in covenant with the Almighty, who is well versed in Torah and whose heart is true, will not find himself entwined in such situations either. Therefore, the one who is not godly and who is evil, Yah has assured will be found out, and he will be uprooted from the congregation of Jehovah. Next, talks about a man who engages in sexual relations with an unbetrothed female Israeli virgin, and it is caught. He will be required to give the woman's father 50 weights of silver and then marry her. This man will never be permitted to send this woman away. Now, circling back, rape in this passage in the Hebrew is shazak, which means to be strong. So applying to the man to be strong, such that a man seizes a woman and overpowers her. The thing to consider here is the father of the unbetrothed woman has the right to accept or deny marriage of his daughter to this rapist. Because in our Western sensibility, we think this is completely off base. How can you force a woman to marry her rapist? Because we view rape in our Western culture as a heinous, heinous crime. And indeed it is. It's terrible. And I'm not going to justify the treatment of the rapist here. The rapist is going to have to pay for his sin, his transgression of Torah. But Father, in his infinite wisdom, did not apply the death penalty to a rapist. In particular here, for an unbetrothed woman. Which seems to suggest a bigger picture here that I'm not altogether sure about. I think there's more to this than meets the eye. Because Father is just in everything, even though his ways are often not our ways. But there seems to be something more to this, something more of justice, and I do like this understanding. It seems to resonate with reasonableness, godly reasonableness, that the father of this unbetrothed woman who has been raped has the right to accept or deny the marriage of his daughter to this rapist. And in either case, the rapist must pay the father the bride price of 50 shekels of silver, essentially a dowry. But somehow, there must be a reckoning of this sin. And what that looks like and why, I'm not entirely sure. Something to really consider here in the future on this passage, future studies of this passage. Hope you guys are getting something out of this. I am loving it. Let's move on to chapter 23, verse 1. And this is about the sacredness of a parent's marriage. The sacredness of a parent's marriage. And verse 1 reads, "A man shall not wed his father's wife, and he shall not uncover his father's skirt." No son of Yisrael shall take, in the Hebrew, take is lakach, which means to be taken in marriage or to be intimate with. No son of Yisrael shall lakach their father's wife. Now, the confusing phraseology of a son, quote, uncovering his father's skirt is best understood as simply marital relations. And skirt is not as we know it here in 21st century Western parlance, that of a woman's article of clothing. It refers to, instead, the son's father's bed cover. It refers to marital relations. Contextually, this passage is not a prohibition against a son marrying his living father's wife, as disgusting as that might be. It is pertaining to the son who elects to wed the wife of his dead father or a former wife of his living father, such that a woman who is divorced from his father. And this was apparently a common practice in certain pagan cultures of ancient Mesopotamia. So we're talking here about the sacredness of a parent's marriage. So we have a prohibition against Yisrael engaging in Canaanite-type incestuous relationship. Now, a lot of folks, commentaries and commentators I've read, say this is not about incest. Well, incest in the sense of relationships. No son should ever have any relationship, physical relationship, with a spouse or former spouse of his father. Plain and simple. And one could try to extrapolate some spiritual application to this mitzvah or not. But the bottom line is that there are boundary lines that Father has established in the body of Messiah. In this particular instance, a son is not to have anything to do with his daddy's spouses, former or current otherwise. Now, in Western culture, we don't see much of that happening. But then that's not necessarily exclusive either. I've come across cases where it has happened. Not personally, but I've read or heard about these cases. And as rare as it is. But this is what the boundary lines Father establishes. This is that forbidden sexual relationships that Father talks about. He doesn't tolerate this stuff. And it's not to happen. It's evil. It crosses the line of his intended. And it disrespects your father completely. It's a sign of disrespect. Now let's look at chapter 3, verse 2 through 9, disqualifiers to worship and fellowship. Let's begin with verse 2 of chapter 23. No one with crushed testes or lopped member shall come into the Lord's assembly. No misbegotten shall come into the Lord's assembly. Even his 10th generation shall not come into the Lord's assembly. No Ammonite nor Moabite shall come into the Lord's assembly. Even his 10th generation shall not come into the Lord's assembly. Verse 5. Because they did not greet you with bread and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and for their hiring against you Balaam, or Balaam, son of Beor, from Aram Naharaim, to curse you. But the Lord your God, Jehovah your Elohim, did not want to listen to Balaam. And the Lord your God turned the curse into blessing for you. For the Lord your God, Jehovah your Elohim, loves you. Verse 7. You shall not seek their well-being and their good all your days forever. You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a sojourner in his land. The sons that are born to them, their third generation may come into Jehovah's assembly. So what we have here is those men with crushed testes or lopped members, verse 2, talks about a prohibition against the common ancient Near East cultic or pagan practice of castration, for the most part, the causing of one to become, quote, unsexed, according to J.H. Hertz, Pentateuch and Haftarah commentary. This passage further speaks of one who is accidentally sexually mutilated, referencing a passage in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 3. But in both situations would result in the individual being barred from worship and from becoming or remaining a member of the community or body of Yisrael. For not being admitted into the community or commonwealth of Yisrael meant such an individual would also be barred from marrying a Yisraeli woman. And at the heart of the matter here, both situations speak clearly to the importance Abba placed on the sanctity of the marriage union and the family that would emerge from that sacred union. And in this case, fatherhood was an extremely important part of being a member of the body of Yisrael. So anything or anyone that would adversely impact the purity and the fruitfulness of the marriage union was not tolerated. For indeed, the family was an integral part of worship and covenant relationship with the Almighty. And for us today, this mitzvah stands as a reminder of the importance Abba places on the integrity and the wholeness of these bodies, or rather these temples of ours. And it is imperative that we safeguard and look after these bodies of ours to ensure that we provide Jehovah's Ruach a pure and sanctified dwelling place so that we may image him to all the world. But the primary takeaway that must always be the state of our hearts towards Jehovah and our neighbor. For the wholeness, the well-being of our bodies means nothing in the eyes of Jehovah if our hearts are uncircumcised. Furthermore, Jehovah demands that we be men, physically and spiritually. He's not looking for men who are less than his ideal man, who is best exemplified in the person of Yeshua HaMashiach. Now, here's something of note. Some contend that one who scriptures describe as being excluded from the assembly of Jehovah, the assembly of the Lord, the assembly of God, means one who is excluded from serving in one of Yisrael's governing bodies, as opposed to being excluded from being a part of the congregation of Yisrael. And the reason given by those who believe Moshe is talking about a governing or a legislative body, as opposed to the congregation of Yisrael, is that the excluded individual's judgments on those governing bodies would be adversely influenced by their particular physical situations. And this seems to me a bit of a stretch, and I can't buy into such thinking. It seems contextually more sensible to conclude Moshe is talking about individuals who are to be excluded from the congregation, the body of Israel. That's where I stand. If you have a difference of opinion and you may agree with these other individuals, that's fine. That's fine. We're all on a journey. We're all searching for truth. And I'd be the first one to say I was wrong, and I will change how I see this passage if proven otherwise. The second part of this is one who is the product of or offspring of an uncertain, in Hebrew of mamzer, a mamzer, or one who is a product or offspring of a dubious sexual relationship, a forbidden sexual relationship. Well, they were also barred from worship and being a member of the body of Israel. Specifically, we're talking here in verse 3, and we can also reference Leviticus chapter 18 and 20. And it is not at all barring those born in what is commonly referred to as wedlock, as some may teach and think, from being members of the body of Israel. If you were unfortunately born out of wedlock, you were not excluded from the community of Israel. However, it's mamzer here. Mamzer provides the clarification we need by stipulating those born of prohibited sexual unions such as incest or adultery, prostitution, etc. And thirdly, in verses 4 through 9, we find that no Ammonite or Moabite, along with their descendants, were prohibited. We find that no Ammonite along with their descendants, were allowed to join or enter the body of Israel or worship because of the way the Ammonites and Moabites treated Israel and the partnership they established with Balaam in the corrupting of the nation at Baal Peor. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1. These, the Ammonites and Moabites, would be prohibited from joining or entering the body of Israel or the congregation of Israel. When read outside of context, it would appear that we have a major contradiction, and I saw that quite early on in my studies here, for we know that Boaz married Ruth, and she was a Moabitess, which would have been a violation if, assuming, well, it wasn't assuming, he did. Boaz marrying Ruth then would have been a violation of Torah, because Ruth was a Moabitess. And what makes this situation even worse is that the Boaz-Ruth marriage led to the birth of King David and ultimately the birth of our Master Yeshua Messiah. But we find in this verse that Moabite and Ammonite are rendered in the masculine. In the masculine. So the so-called sages deduced that this mitzvah was specific to male Moabites and Ammonites. And I would have to agree with those sages, because our Elohim is not a God of confusion, and he doesn't do double talk. That being all said, it is safe to conclude that Abba was prohibiting the inclusion into the body of Israel any Moabite and or Ammonite man or men. I would conclude that this is a restrictive mitzvah in that it was specific for the physical nation of Israel throughout her generations. We don't have any ability to discern who is an Ammonite or a Moabite here today. For all we know, we may be Ammonites or Moabites. Maybe not, but who's to tell? So that is specific. That's restrictive. I would not say we have clear application of that for today. But there are some spiritual applications here. We have to be careful who we invite into our congregations. There's nothing wrong, friends, with being discerning as to who we allow in our midst, into our fellowships, into our homes and our fellowships. I've told you, We've congregated and we've fellowshiped with places, with people and groups that had some terrible folks that were let in, and they just completely disrupted the proceedings and defiled the sacredness of the fellowship. We have to be very careful. We have to be careful who we allow into our midst. Clearly, Abba had a serious issue, though, with the Moabites and the Ammonites. Getting back to this issue, to this passage, especially when we look at this thing from the perspective of him instructing Israel, quote, not to abhor an Edomite and not to abhor an Egyptian, end quote. Both Edom and Egypt provided Israel their fair share of grief throughout their early history. We all know that. But that which the Ammonites and the Moabites did seem to be unforgivable in Yah's sight. That being said, Abba's perspective is the only perspective we must have. And if he said, cut off the Moabite and the Ammonite, that's the way it's got to be. And our perspective on the issue is irrelevant. Moving on. Chapter 3, verses 10 through 15. And here we talk about the warriors of Israel were always to be in a state of ritual purity. Verse 10. When you sally forth in a camp against your enemy, you shall keep yourself from every evil thing. Verse 11. Should there be among you a man who is not clean through nocturnal emission, he shall go outside the camp and not come into the camp. And it shall be toward evening, he shall bathe in water, mikvah, and as the sun sets, he may come inside the camp. Verse 13. And you shall have a marker outside the camp and shall go there outside. And you shall have a spike together with your battle gear, and it shall be, when you sit outside, you shall dig with it and go back and cover your excrement. In verse 15, for Jehovah your Elohim walks about in the midst of your camp to rescue you and to give your enemies before you, and your camp shall be holy, that he should not see among you anything shamefully exposed and turn back from you. The Israeli soldier here was to separate himself from that which was unclean and evil. And I like what J.H. Hertz in his Pentateuch and Haftarah has to say about this insistence that Yisrael's warriors remain in a state of purity or cleanness and separation from that which is evil. He writes, quote, the camp was hallowed by the divine presence and must therefore be a place of purity. Uncleanness leads to ungodliness, end quote. Well, today, we as Yah's spiritual warriors ourselves must remain in a state of cleanness and purity. And this involves not just spiritual cleanness and purity, but also personal and physical purity and cleanness. Too many of us contaminate our covenant relationship and walk with Mashiach by involving ourselves in ungodly things, ranging from the things we entertain ourselves with, terrible things that we have no business entertaining ourselves with, relationships we engage ourselves into, personal habits, and other such things make us spiritually and physically unclean and unworthy as dwelling places for Jehovah's Ruach. Excessive drinking, pornography, bad-mouthing, gossiping, all that stuff. It's not conducive to a dwelling place for Jehovah's Ruach, his spirit. These bodies of ours and the lives we live, to borrow from J.A. Hertz again, his commentary above, are to be hallowed by Yah's divine presence and must therefore be a place of purity. Purity. This is where the spirit and truth of Torah lays or rest. there is still relevance in being pure. Pure of heart, pure of body, pure of actions, pure of heart. These are things that still remain that we must be cognizant of, because Jehovah requires a suitable dwelling place. Looks like we got the landscapers outside, so please bear with me and the noise that may be bleeding through here. But Abba then addresses other personal natural bodily functions that he views as unclean. Nocturnal emissions and excrements, to be specific. I think we all can understand what these are. In both cases, the warrior is instructed to exercise extreme care and be responsible for properly taking care of his own bodily functions. And the reason Father was insistent upon these seemingly innocuous physical situations was that he, being their Elohim who dwelt, a holy Elohim at that, dwelt in their midst, and he walked about their camp. He, being holy, then did not desire, nor should he be exposed to such things as these bodily function, the results of these bodily functions. And then he would be forced to turn back from them, to take his presence away. So, any use of the toilet had to be properly disposed of and covered over. Any nocturnal emissions, well, the person needed to leave the camp for the day and purify himself or mikvah himself, and then he'd be permitted to return. This is all in an effort to remain in a state of purity so we can be and remain in the presence of Jehovah. And the same thing applies to us today. We need to protect our purity at all times and make sure we're in a state of ritual and spiritual and physical purity. Oh, we're running way ahead of time here, way behind time, I should say, but we're moving in toward the end here. Chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, Yisrael to be a place of refuge for the slave. Verse 16 reads, you shall not hand over to his master a slave who escapes to you from his master. Verse 17, with you he shall stay in your midst, in the place that he chooses within one of your gates, wherever is good for him. He shall not mistreat him. Here, Jehovah instructed that Yisrael was to be a safe haven for foreign runaway fugitive slaves. And Yisrael was to be a welcoming place for the slave, who would find peace from his former life of servitude. Abject servitude at that. And that slave would not be returned to his master. This instruction ran contrary to the conventional wisdom and practice of most ancient Near East cultures. Because if you caught a runaway slave or a runaway slave came into your community, you were obliged to return that slave to their master if you could find them. But Yah's ways are truly not the ways of men. And as it relates to slaves within the commonwealth of Yisrael, Abba provided the legal framework for his or her freedom, the sabbatical year. So we're talking here specifically in this passage about foreign slaves. Slaves amongst the Israelis were handled through the framework of Torah and the sabbatical year. But foreign slaves were to be treated differently. They were to be given their freedom and allowed to remain in Yisrael. Now, from a spirit and truth perspective, our faith community must always be a welcoming refuge for those who seek to come out of the physical and spiritual slavery of the world. We must offer them the opportunity without the danger, I should say, of turning them back over to their former foreign master. so that they can start anew and join into the commonwealth of Israel. Thus, these must be taught what walking in obedient covenant relationship with the Almighty looks like. Discipleship. Adopt them as fellow brothers and sisters in the faith once delivered. Disciple them and teach them the gospel that Yeshua taught. Provide them the peaceful oasis we've come to love and enjoy in Yeshua HaMashiach. All right. Verses 18 and 19. This is talking about prostitution and homosexuality strictly prohibited in the holy nation. And verse 18 reads, "There shall be no cult harlot from the daughters of Israel, and there shall be no cult Catamite or Canaanite from the sons of Israel." Verse 19, "You shall not bring a whore's pay nor a dog's price to the house of the Lord your God, Jehovah your Elohim, for any votive offering, for both of them are the abhorrence of Jehovah your Elohim." You see, Jehovah strictly prohibited Israeli women practicing prostitution and Israeli men engaging in homosexuality and also homosexual related prostitution. Yes, there were male prostitutes as well. And any commerce generated from prostitution would be deemed as abominable in the eyes and sight of Jehovah. And there, by extension, it should be by any covenant-walking disciple of Yeshua Messiah. Those funds could not be used in or given to the house of Jehovah or the sanctuary. Sexual misconduct or malfeasance or impropriety, however you choose to express it, at every level, undermines the sanctity and integrity of Jehovah's sanctioned family unit and the marriage union. And additionally, it defiles the bodies of the participants as well as anything that flows from such activities and unions, such as financial transactions or children, just to name a couple. Well, they're all considered abominable by Father. So for us today, sexual sins at every level, undermines and it destroys, in addition to what I've mentioned above, the covenant relationship we have with Jehovah. And those who are caught in the clutches of this evil must be delivered. They must be delivered. And if you are caught in that situation, seek deliverance. Find a brother or sister who can pray and get you. If you're a man, definitely find another man to help you get out of this situation. Because you don't need another woman trying to help you out. I'm just saying I believe women have a very strong place in leadership in the body of Messiah. But in this situation, if you're a man caught in the clutches of such things, then you need to get another man to come in who is filled with the Spirit, who is grounded and mature in the faith, to help get you out of this situation and pray and intercede for you and lay hands on you if so led to do so that you can break that situation, that you can get from under that stronghold and walk in the newness of life. Because if you don't, you're heading down the road to destruction. If there's anything you can get from this and you're in this situation, get out of it. Get out of it now. I think I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to move on. All right. Verse 20 and 21. Yah's people exacting usury is prohibited. Let's read verse 20 and 21. You shall not exact interest from your brother, interest of silver, interest of food, or interest of anything that will bear interest. Verse 21, from the stranger you may exact interest, but from your brother you shall not exact interest, so that the Lord your God, Jehovah your Elohim, may bless you in all that your hand reaches on the land to which you are coming to take hold of it. Usury is the practice of exacting interest on loans that one makes to another. In the case of loans made to one's Yisraeli brother or sister, it was forbidden, pure and simple. However, a Yisraeli may exact interest from a stranger. So in our abstaining from exacting interest on loans we would make to a fellow Yisraeli, we open the door to blessings. If we abstain from exacting this interest on the loans we would make to a fellow Yisraeli, we open the door to blessings from Yehovah because we helped someone who was in need. This is what it's all about. This is loving one another. This is exemplifying what love for one another is. The morality and love of Torah. This is what it looks like. The reason for the prohibition against exacting interest on loans rendered to a brother or sister in our community is easily understood. Yah commanded us to love one another. And this mitzvah is one of the ways we demonstrate that love we are supposed to have for others. Making $1 and a cent off the needs or difficulties of a brother or sister of faith is self-serving. It denies the blessings and providence Jehovah has over our lives. You see, Yeshua himself instructed us to provide for the need of a brother or sister by freely giving him or her that which they needed, expecting nothing in return on our part. Luke chapter 6, verse 27 through 34. I'm not going to read the passage. I have it contained in the show notes for you if you're so interested. So we're supposed to go that extra step. Not only we're not to exact usury or interest on loans we give to a brother or sister in need, but we should give not expecting it back. If you don't have it to give, then you don't have it to give. You don't give expecting to collect some interest and some more stuff on it and then to hound the person for the money back. You obviously didn't have it to give. Or if you did so and you're trying to do it in order to get something more from them than what you gave them, then you need to examine your heart. Have the Holy Spirit examine your heart. But the point is to help a brother and sister in need and go that extra mile and take care of them and love them. This is love in action. How one loves a brother or sister, their neighbor. All right, verses 22 through 24. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, keeping vows we make to Yehovah. And verse 22 reads, should you make a vow to Yehovah your Elohim, you shall not delay fulfilling it. For Yehovah your Elohim will surely require it of you, and there would be an offense in you. Verse 23. And you should, or I should say, and should you refrain from making a vow, there will be no offense in you. The utterance of your lips you shall keep, and you shall do as you have vowed to Yehovah your Elohim, the free will gift that you spoke with your mouth. If you make a vow, you got to keep it. If you make a vow to Yehovah, you best keep it. Let your yeas be yea and your nay. He commands that we keep our word to him always. Whatever vow or pledge we make unto Yehovah, we are bound to keep and fulfill that vow or pledge. And in our fulfilling of those vows and pledges, we are instructed to make haste to fulfill them. Don't string them out over days, months, and even years like so many of us have done. This instruction is unique in that Yehovah also makes an out for those who cannot keep their word to Yehovah. He simply says, keep your physical and spiritual mouth closed and don't make a vow or pledge to Yah. Our master backed up this mitzvah when he taught his disciples the following in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. And the King James reads, again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto Jehovah thine oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou canst not make one hair white or black. But let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. You see, the bottom line, my brothers and sisters, is there's absolutely nothing wrong with making pledges or oaths in the service of Jehovah, to Jehovah. Desiring to do something to glorify or please Jehovah is always a good thing. And making a pledge or putting forth an oath to do that pleasing thing for Jehovah or to Jehovah is only good if one actually carries it out. The problem with making promises to Jehovah is that Jehovah will hold us to, it's not really a problem, but it's a problem if you don't intend to keep it. You have to fulfill it. And Yeshua, our master, admonished us to simply not make promises to Jehovah. He instead admonished us to simply do that which we are led to do without uttering a word. Just do it. Just do it. You see, it's human nature, unfortunately, from time to time to make promises to Jehovah and not keep them. It's best to simply not make the promises in the first place. So go forth and do that good thing that will be pleasing to Jehovah with a pure and loving heart. And in so doing, Yah will bless in the end. Well, we're at the last portion of our Torah reading for today. Verses 25 and 26, satisfying one's hunger versus being greedy. And let's just read this here. Should you come into your fellow man's vineyard, and you may eat grapes as much as you crave, to your fill, but you shall not put them in your pouch. Verse 26, should you come into your fellow man's standing grain, you may pluck tender ears with your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle on your fellow man's standing grain. Jehovah provides a simple command, I should say, that shows forth one's love and respect for his fellow neighbor. If one is traveling in Israel and is hungry, he or she may eat from an owner's standing field of produce. It's a free provision that Father commands all who he has blessed to bless others. Jehovah, on the other hand, draws the line at one taking advantage of the blessings bestowed upon them by that owner, that blessing, that free will blessing that the owner is obliged to provide any sojourner who crosses their field. But then having that sojourner come in, partake of that bounty, of that free will, but then greedily heaping unto for him or herself beyond that which satisfies their immediate hunger. In other words, they'll eat to their fill and then they'll stuff their pockets with what's remaining or whatever more they can take. That is greed. That is taking advantage of a brother or sister, their sister or brother or sister's goodwill. His obedience to Torah, her obedience to Torah, by providing you this wonderful blessing of feeding you off their land. Greed has no place in Yah's way of life. To do so, to stuff one's pocket after being fed off their bounty of your neighbor's field, is to show a gross disrespect for the person who's providing for you. And the spiritual application cannot be denied here. When we are materially blessed by the provisions of a brother or sister in the faith, well, we're compelled to not take advantage of that brother or sister's kindness and provision. And it befalls us to bless Jehovah for the provision and to show our respect for the individual or individuals who provided for our need by being respectful and appreciative and thankful and being humble. This is what loving one another looks like in this passage of ours, our Torah reading today. The morality and love of Torah is shown brightly here in this passage. Father, thank you for this time of fellowship and this time of study of your word. I ask, Father, that we will be able to feast upon this word in this coming week and bless our families and bless our walk. Keep, guide, and deliver according to your perfect will and your abundance in heaven. We love you and give you praise. In our Master's name, Yeshua, Messiah. Well, brothers, I pray that you got something out of this, and I won't belabor it long. We've been long here. Woo! It was a long reading with so much content. So it is always my hope, trust, and prayer that you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. And until next time, take care.